Hello, everyone, and welcome to Data Faces, the podcast that brings the human stories behind data, analytics, marketing, and AI to the forefront. I'm David Sweenar, founder of Tiny Tech Guides, your host for today's conversation. Today, we're going to talk into a topic that every product marketer faces, and it's going to hit home to every B2B product marketer. Why your messaging isn't working, and more importantly, how to fix it. So today, we're lucky to have Gabby Contreras of Skyline Marketing. She is an expert product marketing consultant. She's got deep experience in B2B SaaS marketing. She helps companies sharpen and refine their messaging and communicate real value to customers. So if your messaging is not punchy enough, if you're struggling to gain alignment across teams, or you're just trying to cut through the noise, this podcast is for you. So let's dive into it. Gabby, welcome to the Data Faces podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave. I'm super excited to be here with you today.
Excellent. So, Gabby, can you just tell us a little bit about your background and your company, what you do?
Absolutely. So I'm founder of Skyline Marketing, and really we're focused on helping startups better position themselves, helping them cut through the noise, tell better product stories that really resonate with buyers, and helping them get away from the jargon land and the buzzword land and really speak to things that they're doing in a really simple and humanistic way. And yeah, I've been in the B2B SaaS space for the last 8 years, 10 years in marketing communications, and I just love being in product marketing and working with early stage founders and GTM teams, helping them with their messaging and their positioning. And I also partner with Emma Stratton, helping marketing teams, develop new techniques to write better messaging.
Excellent. Well, that's a great intro and background. And Gabby, it seems so simple to me. There's typically three core value props and three core differentiators or points of distinction. And you've worked with a ton of marketing teams and companies. What's the number one messaging mistake you see at companies make over and over? Where are they going wrong?
Absolutely. So I would say the messaging mistake is usually almost always a reflection of the GTM strategy, but really the biggest mistake that I keep seeing over and over again is just positioning to everyone. You can't be everything to everyone. And unfortunately, I see a lot of startups, especially once they hit like that Series B stage, they got a new round of funding, they're looking to keep growing, and they've already found a niche that really loves the product. They get great value from it. And then there is that desire to move up market, to branch into other markets. And so that leaves the marketing team figuring out how to speak to all these different pain points and speaking to all these different personas in a similar way. And unfortunately, that doesn't really help to shape a very clear story or a clear narrative. So for instance, Segment is an example of a company that fell, I wouldn't say victim, but culprit of doing this, right? So they're a customer data routing platform, and they were trying to speak to the devs, to the product managers, to the e-com managers, to the marketers. And because they were trying to talk to too many people, they ended up, losing to Amplitude and Mixpanel, which these companies had a narrower, messaging and the audiences that they were speaking to. And unfortunately, it's something that we see a little bit of everywhere. So I would say the best way for product marketers that are working on this messaging to really tackle this problem is to really answer the question, which audiences are most urgently going to be raising their hands for this particular product? And how can we speak more directly to that audience instead of trying to tackle 3 to 4 different people that we're speaking to and trying to kind of cram all these different value and benefit statements into one? Ruthless narrowing and prioritization and segmentation at the end of the day is what can really help to combat that.
I love that. I love that concept. Let's maybe dig down a little bit on this. So we have buyer personas, we have user personas, and then oftentimes, maybe you got to cater to an IT personas in the mix. So, when you say narrow your personas, like who do you focus on? Is it IT, or is it the CFO writing the big check? Is it the CMO if you're making marketing software, or the users of it? Like what do you recommend to companies?
I mean, it all depends on what are the types of materials that you're working on, right? So obviously, if you know that your buyers are going to be like the customer experience leader, then of course you need to speak to the person that is going to be signing off on this. But if there are other influencers involved in this deal, like say the e-commerce manager or maybe the analyst, it's important to include messaging for how you're speaking to them in maybe some of the more targeted blogs or the email campaigns that you're sending out that are kind of used to encourage people to understand what it is that you're doing. So really it's about understanding where you're speaking to these different people, and that can kind of also help you narrow down the formats and who to focus your messaging on. We know that especially in for like these larger deals, you're speaking to a lot of different people who are involved in that sales conversation. So, also doing a little bit of customer journey mapping can help you understand, like, okay, we know that these people are coming up the most at this stage of the conversation. Then that means that I probably need to help my sales team have better talk tracks for this persona, maybe a one-pager or a landing page that they can share with them to specifically speak to what it is that they care about. So it requires just taking a little bit more time to pick up on these patterns of who you're speaking to at these different stages in these conversations. So that way you're not using too general of too broad of a message, and you can really start to like resonate with the people that are most brought into these conversations at these different stages.
Okay, well, that's great advice. And so I think in B2B software, especially, I think a lot of the software capabilities will say they're becoming a little bit commoditized. So they roughly do the same sort of stuff. Maybe some buttons are shinier in this software versus that software, but I think that leads us to a lot of the B2B messages. They all sound the same. Hey, we're open, we're flexible, we can lower risk. So what can companies do, or product marketing managers do? What can they do to stand out without losing credibility?
Yeah, so this is so true. And it's interesting because I was doing a little bit of research, and there are over 30,000 software companies globally right now. 30,000. Wow. So imagine like the scale, it's such a saturated space. Like we all know this, and we feel it as marketers as, like the next day you see, and especially, oh my gosh, my product marketers and competitive intel, my heart goes out to you, because you create all of this collateral right. And then all of a sudden this new competitor comes in and you're like, oh my God, I didn't even hear about this company. And here they are putting together all of the same messaging that we have. And it's a whole freak out situation. It's really hard because, like you say, the reality is that nowadays differentiation is pretty narrow depending on which markets you're in, right? But I'd say that the best way to combat that is staying close to your customer and having a voice of customer program. And when I say a VOC program, it doesn't have to be like a huge, customer intelligence analysis. Unless your team has the capacity for that, then that's great. But if not, it can be something where you're just regularly collecting insights from customers through interviews, through win-loss interviews. These kind of programs can give you some of those sound bites and those tidbits that you can use as a foundation for your messaging. Because the reality is, if you're not letting customers do the talking, that's when your messaging starts to go into jargon land, because right. You're losing that connection into what customers are really saying. And look, I know a lot of times you can't use the customer logo or the customer name, and that can suck. I worked with a cybersecurity client who they couldn't say anything. They couldn't use their customers' information. But you can get creative with it. You can take an anonymous interview style, like in the documentaries, where it's like someone with like the distorted voice and
with the crazy lighting, you don't really know who they are.
Exactly, with the crazy lighting. Or you can do like a confessions of campaign series, which can also be really fun. But in the end, you can also just use the actual words and the sound bites from what customers are saying and pick up on these patterns. Like you'll start to find, the more that you do this, the more you'll find patterns in what people are saying they really love about your product and how they're using it. And that, I would say that that's my biggest recommendation, especially as the space continues to get more and more saturated.
I'm wondering. I'm curious about something. I totally agree with you. And I always say you can't do marketing from an ivory tower. So you have to get down there and understand, what the customers are saying. I see in a lot of organizations that product marketing managers, particularly, are being pulled in all these directions, and the teams are shrinking. And so what I see happening is most of the conversations with customers, they're either through the product management team or through the customer success team, typically in a lot of organizations. I wonder if you're seeing that. Like, what can a PMM do to insert themselves in those conversations? Because they're happening, but usually they're not included because they got to go create decks for an event or work on messaging or fix the website or do stuff, and they're missing on the gold that informs the messaging that would help the company overall. I'm wondering if you're seeing something similar.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, especially at bigger organizations where everyone is working in a pretty siloed manner. Something that I've seen work really well, again, earlier stage, right? So
Sure.
things are a little bit more connected. But if you're able to create good partnership with the customer success team, where maybe there are certain points in the customer journey where, if a customer meets certain requirements, you can be invited to shadow a call, to
Mhm.
shadow a QBR, to join in the last 10 minutes, right? I think there are like small things like that where it's not eating up a ton of your time or a ton of the product marketer's time. But if you're able to align on very specific milestones in the customer's journey, and especially if it's maybe a customer in a particular vertical that that you're wanting to learn more about,
Right.
having this sort of alignment can help to create more of like a systematic way to participate, or at the very least listen in on some of these conversations. But of course, outside of this, I think that's where the value of conversation intelligence tools really comes in.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
for
I've seen
the
some organizations using
yeah,
gong calls. Those are
the
always full of gold. But the issue is, they get so many of them. You got to find out like
right,
what's in all
like
these things.
right. Then that's the overwhelm of having too much data to parse through. Yeah, that's the flip side. And I mean, that's the ideal state. But that's just something that I've seen maybe on a more, if you're stuck in maybe a more manual stage
Right.
of your organization, if the marketing program is still growing and you're still building out some of those initial phases, that can be something that can help of just embedding yourself into the process a little bit more and building trust with the relationship
Sure.
managers first and
Excellent.
foremost,
Yeah,
because
I like that. And so find a way for PMMs out there. Find a way to insert yourself in that conversation. Either listen to gong calls or come up with these. I like that milestone process idea. So Gabby, we've both done a lot of messaging in our careers, and what I see is, let's talk about teams, the different teams that are involved in having to approve or inform and agree with the messaging. So we got, typically what I've seen is marketing, and I'm guilty of this. I have too much gobbledygook in there, so too many buzzwords. Product teams want to be, just too technical. Always want every feature function that's in there, and especially for larger product teams. And then, sales, they want something, just an easy talk track that they can remember that's differentiating. So, like, how do you how do you gain alignment across these teams who have really just sort of sometimes conflicting needs and wants? How do you rein this in?
yeah. So I have two parts of the answer to this question. First, trying to get them in the room when these initial conversations are happening is really important. Not bringing people in at the end when you're already like presenting what the positioning is going to be and what the core messages are, because at that point you've already lost them. And
Right.
I'll give you an example of where I've seen that go really wrong in my experience. So I remember one time we had just rolled out all of the positioning and the messaging, and then one of the new hotshot AEs decided to go rogue, and he hired his own designer and I guess marketing person to
Oh, wow.
create his own sales. I mean, it was, to be fair, it was just a slide,
Sure.
but still, to create a slide and his own talk track for it. And I remember at the time I was so shocked. I was like, wow, the audacity. But at the same time, looking back on that experience, it's because there was no buy-in in the first place.
Right.
Like, he hadn't been brought into the conversation, Like if you don't have people involved in the initial conversations, then there's no way you'll have that alignment across the board. Like you have to have at least like one champion from every department that's going to be involved in these discussions. Otherwise, that's how you get to this place where sales is making their own slides. They're not talking about things with the right messaging. Like they're just doing their own thing. And then the second piece of that, I will say, is before you get into the messaging, really align on what you're saying and ultimately what is that positioning, right? So really get aligned on what is the main value that you're talking about and what are the benefits supporting that value and why this matters. And it's important to align on the what that you're saying so that you're not arguing over the words. Because I think that's where there's often that disconnect where you'll have an exec come in like, well, it's not quite that we do that. It's actually more that we do this. And really it's that customers like this and not that. So then you get into back and forth on the what, and then you end up going in circles and circles and circles. So first align on the structure and the value that you're really going to be talking about. So that way the messaging conversation becomes more of like, oh, well, maybe we can, use this word to inspire more curiosity or this word to better match our brand voice, So starting from really aligning on the strategy is super important to make sure you're getting that cross-functional alignment.
Okay, I think that's great advice. And I think it really just comes back to what you said in the beginning is, you really got to understand the persona that you're talking to, sort of like Jeffrey Moore, like what's your beachhead, start there.
Yes.
And, have that, maniacal and ruthless prioritization on that. One question that came to mind as you're describing this is, so you get your messaging and your positioning done, and now we need a new sales deck, right? You always need a sales deck to go with this. And I've seen like, nobody can really agree on what the ideal sales deck is. Like sometimes the senior leaders or executives, they want like an EBC or like an event type deck, which is very different than I think a deck you would use for, maybe a one-to-one sales engagement. How do you rein them in? Like they just don't agree on what they want. And who wins. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen it. Just curious your perspective on that.
I think there's only so much you can do at that stage, right? The way that I approach that, honestly, is just giving them, giving them the colors that we want them to use, giving them the canvas that we would like them to use, encouraging a certain direction in terms of the technique. But at the end of the day, like a salesperson is going to want to create his artwork the way that he wants to create it. So to a certain degree, it's like, sometimes I think it's less about enforcing for the sake of enforcing and just really explaining the why of why we're heading in this direction or why we're using this format and making sure that it's something that they can also agree with and finding a balance there. Because also it's like, I'm not trying to kill anyone's, their mojo or the way that they like to go in and do what they do best. And I think sometimes as product marketers, we kind of try to get a little bit too micromanaging in that way. So, not a direct answer to your question, which I think is just, offering them some templates that they can work with, maybe joining some conversations to see what are some similar ways that they're framing some of these ideas so that you can then create some better visuals to support the way that they are saying this. That might be my only other addition to that.
Sure. Yeah. As a PMM, I think there's also, these different levels of decks. There's the very high level, almost like a corporate deck. And then there's like a 101, a 201, and 301, depending on the technical detail you need. So,
absolutely.
All right. So how about this? Let's move on to another question I was thinking about is, you talked to a lot of companies, and I was checking out your webpage earlier, but can you walk us through a time when a client had to really unlearn everything they knew about messaging and why and what changed?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'll share this story of a client that I worked with. First off, one of my favorite founders that I've ever worked with in my life. She's so amazing. Her name is Fang Cheng. She just such a brilliant mind, PhD in bioinformatics, then went on to create this, at the time, like a very, very new way to use AI to automate chat conversations, which now we know chat automation. But when she first started and started building out her initial solution and her platform, the way that she was approaching the problem was really new in the sense that she created these patented vertical AI models to basically deeply understand common and nuanced retail and e-commerce needs, and be able to quickly train the AI on these like common questions, concerns, issues, escalations, so that the chatbot could very easily and quickly reach resolution with these customers. Obviously, when she and I first sat down, she gave me her whole pitch, and it was so technical.
Right.
Like, what do you mean by your NLU models? Like, what do you mean by this? And it was great because I actually learned a lot in those initial conversations about NLU models. But at the same time, it was like, okay, we've got to find a better way to translate the way that you're talking about your technology, which is great. Obviously, it's doing some awesome things for your customers. And they were working with great brands, being a really early stage startup. But and she would go into these conversations with CX leaders, and they would be super inspired by the energy that she brought into the conversation.
Right.
But it wasn't like they were like fully, they were just like, okay, yeah, I can kind of, but it took a lot of explaining to get them to really understand what it is that they were talking about, that Fang was talking about. And so in the end, what we did was we shifted the messaging to be less focused on these proprietary verticalized AI models and more on the fact that they were trained on e-commerce and retail. And because of that, they were able to understand very nuanced issues and quickly resolve customer issues faster than your average chatbot, which at the time, and I would say still today, generally speaking, is just gives you the runaround and doesn't really give you what you need. And it also, did consultative selling. There were so many aspects to it that were so much more sophisticated than what the rest of the market was doing. And so with, we updated their sales messaging. We also created a new, how it works technology page, which is also where messaging goes hand in hand with good visual storytelling, right? Like, how are you telling a good before and after picture? That is sometimes what's needed in order to have the aha moment. The words need to be simple and concise so that somebody can easily get the gist. But the visuals are really what can complement what it is that you're saying on the messaging standpoint, and then bring the whole thing home. And, luckily for them, the company Link got acquired by Capacity. They were able to successfully exit with a clearer story. And, in the end, it helped to simplify their story and to simplify their narrative. But I think that's just an example of where getting deep enough to be able to translate that technical jargon into something that a business buyer is going to understand is super important in order to be able to have these conversations with potential buyers as well as potential, acquirers,
Yeah, sure. And I've definitely seen that. A lot of founders, they bring this energy and this aura, and they're the only ones that can give the pitch they're giving because they have this, gravitas about them. So, but it doesn't really work for the rest of the organization. It only works for that unique individual.
Exactly.
So, this notion, let's maybe double click down on this translation notion. So is there a process you follow to take these, very maybe technical SaaS solutions into something that, someone like me, a human-centered message, I can understand it, but you don't want to make it like so basic. You don't want to dumb it down, right? So
Absolutely.
what is that balancing act that where you need to walk on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I use Emma Stratton's methodology. Shameless plug for Emma Stratton and her punchy methodology for how she approaches messaging. I really like the way that she's created this framework of basically applying what's called the VBF rule to whatever it is that you're trying to message. So it stands for value first, benefit second, and feature last. So a lot of times, as product marketers, we get really excited about the features. We get really excited about the technology, the how, right? And so we lead with, like with this intuitive dashboard, you can achieve X, Y, and Z. You can do this more efficiently, faster. But the problem with that is that you're using inside out messaging. So from me, the product, the company, out instead of outside in, which is taking into account what your audience, what your buyer really cares about. What is the superpower that they're gaining? So what you're doing is you're basically, figuring out the how. So you already know the how, okay?
Right.
What is it that the how enables you to do? So what are those benefits? Like now you can work faster, work smarter, be able to have all of your data in one place. And then from there, the work is moving from benefits into the big win or the value. So what is the big thing that your customer, your user gains from whatever it is that your product is doing? And so by using that framework, you can, easily translate the how into the what and then into the big win. Now, I say easily, it's easier said than done.
We could say it. It's
Yeah,
hard work. It's hard work for sure.
That's where the finesse comes in, because it can be really hard to figure out what's a benefit, what's a value, right? Because sometimes you can flip them, and it's like, well, this is really important, but maybe it's this or maybe it's that, and that's really where the messaging work is taking the time to really marinate and see where it is that you can understand whether something is truly a big win for your customer or whether it's just like something that helps them in a like smaller or less important way. And then the second piece on this is also altitude. So I think that's where what you're talking about of translating something really technical into more simplified messaging, that's also part of the work, which is figuring out, who are you talking to? Are they going to care more about the foundational technology? So maybe if you're speaking to a developer, obviously, like they're going to not want the marketing BS. They're like, no, I don't want any of that fluff. Give it to me straight. Like, what is this really the value that I'm going to be getting? And that's where having a lower altitude, where you're more deeper in the weeds, will kind of be a more valuable way to speak to this person. Versus if it's a CFO high level, they're like, okay, I don't care so much about that, but how is this going to help me do my job better? And how am I going to make sure that this is not going to be interfering with any of the systems that we already have in place, et cetera? So that would be the other component is altitude, knowing where to keep your message on that spectrum and how to translate that into something that makes sense for the audience that you're talking to.
So Gabby, that's I love that answer. Maybe just one on this value benefit feature framework. I love that concept, and I've written plenty of messaging documents over a number of companies. Hey, maybe one of them is we're going to increase productivity. Like I've never felt like I needed to have more productivity personally.
Right.
Like it sounds good. It's unproductive enough. It sounds good. Like for a business. Oh yeah, the business wants to be more productive. But in the end, there are users, there are people using. So the business is going to be more productive. But like, what's that balance of this? You speak to like the value I'm personally going to get. Like maybe I don't have to work 25 hours a day. I know there's only 24 hours a day, but you sort of get the idea. Like, what's the or the emotional attachment or like personal value? How much of that do you see companies bringing out or not? There's still, hey, reduce risk, more productivity, optimize, blah blah blah. I don't need to be optimized.
I don't need to be optimized. I want to put that on a t-shirt, Dave. Oh my God.
There we go.
Please don't optimize me. I'm good.
Exactly.
But you're so right, and I think that's where we have to be less robotic in the way that we're speaking, because obviously you're talking to another human. They're the ones that are going to be using this product. It can be kind of scary to just say like 10x your productivity. Like, what does that really mean? And that's where tapping into the human emotion comes in. Like it's less so 10x your productivity and more about freeing yourself from these annoying, tedious tasks that are slowing you down and making you spend a million hours jumping from spreadsheet to spreadsheet. Right. So that's where it's like you have to be able to tap into that human emotion. And I think there's some really good techniques out there where you can take the increased productivity and then or I can explain it. So you take something like increased productivity and you ask yourself, okay, like, so what? So I can do my
Right.
work faster. So what? So that I'm less stressed about having to report into my next meeting. And you keep on digging into that, and then you get more and more into some of the more emotional components of what it is that you're saying. And once again, that's another technique that Emma Stratton teaches in her workshops, is how do you double click into the like generalized word that we all
Right.
use and make it mean something
That's right.
truly.
I like that. Don't be annoyed. Reduce your annoyance factor. But it's very similar to like the five whys in like Six Sigma Lean. Just keep asking why,
Yeah,
why, until you get down to the root cause.
exactly,
All right.
exactly.
So probably have time for two more questions here. So let's talk about, you said you work a lot with early stage
Mhm.
startups and I'm sure many other clients, but how do you see their message evolve, or, as they,
Mhm.
find their product market fit? I think these you have an idea, and sometime in the future, it's a little bit different. Some of the
Yeah,
core elements are there, but how does their messaging evolve, and what have you seen there? And you
yeah.
think things
So
become more competitive too, probably as other people are like, oh, there's an
yeah,
opportunity here. So I'd love to hear your perspective on
right.
that.
Exactly. So really, it's about whether or not you're evolving with the market. And I think that's where having a market intelligence effort is important, where you're really understanding, okay, what new players are in this market? How is the technology advancing? How are the buying decisions happening in different ways? What is the spend that's being invested into these types of technologies right now versus a year ago versus 3 years ago? You have to have a pulse on these things. Otherwise, the messaging doesn't evolve with the market. So I can give you an example of that. When I was initially developing, marketing strategies for contact center AI, I would say like 6, 7 years ago,
Sure.
it was the hot new thing, right? So
Right.
at the
Right.
time, there weren't a lot of vendors that were really expensive. They were just crappy, like they
Right.
did.
Right.
I'm sorry, like let's keep it real. There was like super inaccurate and undependable outputs. They couldn't really use these insights in any way that made any sense. And when I say insights, it's like being able to understand what customers are saying in like customer service conversations and doing something with that, right?
Hmm.
So at that time, as contact center AI was coming into the scene, what we were doing was really new because the technology was much more advanced. It was more accurate. The speech recognition and detection was just more evolved than what a lot of these other players were
Right.
doing. So because of that, we were able to apply a really fresh messaging, a fresh approach into, actually being able to get analysis and insights on customer intent, on sentiment. All of these things were, I wouldn't say that they were new, but actually being able to use them and for them to detect more nuanced aspects of the conversations was new. So at the time I was like, oh my gosh, we got to focus on this. This is our messaging. This is our positioning. But then, now the market has evolved a lot since then.
Sure.
Now there are so many players. You have Zoom came out with a contact center. You have Amazon contact center. Like you have all of these other players, vendors that have entered the market, which, now we know it is conversation intelligence that's
Yeah.
used
Sure.
for the contact center and CCaaS, right? And with that shift, the messaging has to change, and it has to be more about how what you're doing is solving the problem in a different way. And
Yep.
again, once again, that goes back into positioning, right? Which is
Yep.
really being able to understand what problem you're solving for, who your competitors are, how what you're doing is different, and understanding the market context of what you're doing. And all four of those pieces have to be taken into account. And as companies evolve, sometimes the messaging stays in how we're solving the market problem, and it doesn't shift as much
Right.
into, okay, this is how we're solving the market problem differently from everyone else. I
Right.
think
Right.
that is a harder, because it's a moving target, right? Because
Yep.
technology is evolving so fast these days, so fast. I have a theory that I think that's why time feels like it's moving faster too. But that's topic for another day.
We have a
Um,
whole other podcast on that one.
like truly. But because of that, it's like it's really hard to actually evolve your messaging at the speed that it needs to evolve, because the competitive nature of what you're doing changes weekly.
Sure.
um,
Yep. Yep.
so, keeping a pulse on that is important, and doing the best that you can to tell real differentiated customer stories, I think is the best approach to that. And being able to really deeply explain, like, how is it that this company actually used the technology to improve these specific areas in their business,
Sure.
and how they did it actually deeper level than just, again, improve productivity, increased efficiency,
Right.
like actually though.
Let's optimize for sure. All
Aside
right.
from optimizing. Yeah.
All right. So maybe the last question before we wrap is, if you can give one piece of, let's call it maybe unpopular advice to B2B marketers about messaging, what is that piece of advice?
Yeah. So less of an unpopular opinion and more about a reminder. Your product is not the hero, your customer is. Sometimes we accidentally get really caught up, especially when we lower our product and we're super excited. We're like, oh man, this new add-on, this new feature, da, da, da. I get it. Like, I fangirl over the products that I'm working on too. But you got to translate it. Again, you got to translate it into what it is that how is that helping your customer be the hero in their organization? How is that helping them get their next promotion? How is that helping them look good in front of their boss? So as much as you can really think and bring that attitude and angle into the marketing and the messaging that you're working on, the more successful you're going to be, and the more you're really going to be able to stand out.
I love that advice, and I think I have it in a book here. Nancy Duarte, Resonate, and she
Oh
has a whole
yeah.
thing. Yes, yes, you're not the hero; it's your audience, and I put that in a couple of the books I've written. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. So, so with that, Gabby, how can people find you if they want to know more, if they want to? How can they get a hold of you? And just, any last pieces of advice for our listeners? I mean, this has been an amazing discussion. We can go on and on, but I think we're coming to a close. So, any last minute piece of advice, and how can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can totally reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me a DM. I'd love to chat and talk through some of the challenges that you're facing. If you have a team of marketers that you think could really benefit from maybe getting all into the same room and having some fun with some messaging, I would love to get you set up with Punchy, and I can help you guys through a messaging workshop and kind of help you learn some new techniques. So you can reach out to me for that as well. And you got this. You got this. You can do this. Last words of encouragement. The most important thing, I think, as marketers sometimes is we can tend to get a little bit lost in the data, especially as product marketers. Sometimes we think that everything needs to be, backed by data. Usually it does, but sometimes you just have to trust your gut.
Sure.
Trust your gut.
All right. Words of wisdom right there. Very sage advice. Well, Gabby, thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. Lots of tactful, real world advice for people. So I think our listeners are going to enjoy it. And I want to say thank you for being on the Data Faces podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Dave.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.